You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. I've got a great interview for you in this episode. It's a discussion with James and Taylor Davis, who run a podcast called One Free Family. And we're talking about peaceful parenting, unschooling, self-directed learning, and many other interesting topics. I mentioned James and Taylor in a recent episode, Leadership and Parenting, when I talked about some of the conversations that we'd had recently when they came to visit us. And now in this episode, you can hear me talk directly to James and Taylor about their ideas on parenting. First up is just a quick reminder that you can support The Voluntary Life by becoming a patron on Patreon. Supporters get many rewards, including bonus episodes every week. And many of my supporting listeners are also doing coaching with me, which is one of the options that you can get depending on the level that you sign up at Patreon. So if you're interested in finding out about that and many other awards, check out the link that I will put directly in the show notes, which you can access on your podcast player, or you can go to my website, thevoluntarylife.com, or directly to my Patreon page, which is at patreon.com/thevoluntarylife. So without further delay, here's my interview with James and Taylor Davis. So I'm very happy to welcome James and Taylor Davis from One Free Family. Hi guys, welcome to The Voluntary Life.
Hey Jake, we miss you.
Thanks for having us, Jake. We're excited to be talking to you.
Yeah, it's great to connect with you. It's funny that we're actually having this discussion on Skype because you guys flew all the way across the Atlantic to come and visit us, and we had a great time and lots of really good chats. But we were having too much fun to do any recording, and so we didn't get a chance to record some of the conversations that we had, which were really interesting about unschooling and parenting and so forth. And just as a way of a bit of background, I spoke a little bit about sort of summarizing some of my thoughts about the subject and one of the conversations that we had. And James, you have already been on the show and talking about unjobbing. I'll put a link to that in the show notes for people who are interested. But I thought just to start off, it would be really interesting for people who don't know your podcast and your website, One Free Family, to say a little bit about what it's all about, really. And so you've started this podcast called One Free Family. So what was your idea in doing this podcast, and who are you trying to reach?
Yeah, that's a great question. We started the podcast in January, I think, and what?
You didn't know the time. So.
I think it was January. It's June now. That sounds about right. And, we'd actually tossed around the idea for a while of having a podcast, but it just felt like there were a few humps that were hard to get over, namely just the time that we had to be able to edit and produce something and do all of that, amongst all of the other things that we do. And then a friend of ours who lives here in New Hampshire with us approached us and actually asked us if we would consider doing a podcast about parenting. And, through his company, he would edit it and produce it and put it out into the world. So it felt like it was meant to be. And it was perfect timing because that took a lot of the back end work off of our plates that we just didn't feel like we could commit the time to.
Yeah. And I think in terms of another reason why we didn't start, I think right away was we weren't sure what our voice would be in this specific space.
Yeah.
We've been consuming media about parenting, from books to podcasts and videos and everything in between for quite some time. But, a lot of it, I think, felt covered to us. But as we've gotten more involved in the space, through both our work, through the unschooling related summer camps we've worked with, and our own parenting, we realized we felt like there was a lack of people just kind of talking about their own process and their own journey. And I think there's a lot of people telling other parents what they should do in terms of parenting, and not that many people that are just kind of along for the ride. It's kind of, it reminds me of how you approach your podcast, Jake, where it's like, I'm going to go engage this piece of media and try to figure out what I think about it, right? And kind of have a more open-ended discussion, not one that tells people you should be ashamed of yourself if you parent in such and such a way, or, a podcast that pats unschoolers on the back for being unschoolers, which I think is unfortunately the tone of a lot of unschooling related media out there, but one that's more practical. What are we working through right now? What's hard for us today? What's hard for our listeners today? And kind of just engaging in this ongoing thought experiment of trying to parent in the 21st century, So we also have a Facebook group, a One Free Family, where I know you and Hannah both are, where people can just go and talk about what's going on in their mind. And you'll find people from the very traditional parenting paradigms all the way through to the most radical of unschoolers as well, just talking in a helpful and open-minded way to try and figure out what's best. I think that's like, if I could sum up the goal of our show and our parenting approach in general, it's how can we continue to move closer and closer to being the best parents possible, rather than, pretend like we've arrived and figured it all out and then sharing our wisdom with the masses,
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to say, I think that, you have a very positive and constructive approach, and I really love your show. I'm really enjoying it. I learn a lot from it, and it's very thought-provoking. I find it very helpful because you're talking about both some high-level concepts about parenting, but also about really specific things that you encounter, whether that's bedtimes and, those kind of specific challenges. And it's all done in a very, very constructive way. So I think it's great. And I really recommend people should definitely check it out, because I'm getting a lot from it.
Thanks, man.
Thanks so much, Jake. I appreciate that.
So I wanted to ask you about your journey to thinking about these ideas, because you both come from a background of being teachers, as far as I understand. You trained as teachers. So in a way, your training when thinking about parenting and children is kind of traditional, I guess. So, and yet you're doing a podcast about some very untraditional ideas. So can you explain a little bit about your own journey to thinking about these things?
Sure. Yeah, James and I both were trained to be teachers in college, and I actually taught for, I think, 5 years at a private school. I taught 5th grade, and James actually decided not to go into teaching. So we were trained very traditionally, and then our path to kind of finding this less traditional approach to education and parenting, we kind of fell into it after our first child was born. So almost 8 years ago, he'll be 8 in a couple weeks. He was born, and he was a baby who really knew what he wanted and would not give up in telling us what he wanted and in making it really clear to us. And, the whole first year of his life, I think we really spent in conflict with ourselves and with him, because we were trying really hard to parent the way that, the messages from mainstream culture were telling us to parent. So, I had this idea that he needed to learn to be independent and learn to sleep in his crib, once he was a couple months old. And, I had to go back to work and he had to go to daycare. And there was a lot of just conflict and tension between us. And there was this little voice inside of me saying, like, there's got to be a better way. This shouldn't feel so hard for everybody. And so that was happening at the same time. At work one day, I had kind of like a professional development work day, and they showed us this video, and it was the RSA Animate talk of Sir Ken Robinson, and the name of the talk was Schools Kill Creativity. It was kind of ironic that it was being shown to me at professional development, where I was a teacher.
Right.
And I was a teacher who was being asked to kind of basically teach a math curriculum straight from a book. So I actually didn't have much space to, foster the creativity that everybody innately does have and that I knew was there for my students. So that happened, shortly after I went back to work after he was born. And I came home that day and I said, James, you have to watch this. And I pulled it up for him and he watched it. And that kind of opened the doors for us. From there, we just kind of went down the internet rabbit hole of, unschooling, self-directed education. I had already started to engage with some attachment parenting materials. And from there, it just kind of blew wide open. And that's where we really started to question, I think, everything that we thought we would do as parents.
Right. Absolutely. I think that's really interesting to hear that journey. And in terms of where you got to, there's a few different concepts that I wanted to talk about with you. Obviously, we could go into some really specific things, but I think what would be helpful in this podcast is to talk more about the principles behind your approach to parenting and to unschooling. The first thing I wanted to ask you about is the tagline of your show, which is a new take on peaceful parenting. So I've done episodes on peaceful parenting in the past, and this is obviously something that is at the core of your approach. But I wanted to ask you what you take peaceful parenting to mean, and what does that mean for you, and what does it mean in terms of the way that you approach parenting?
Yeah, it's funny. Peaceful parenting is one of those concepts that I think it's funny because it's kind of a loaded term, right? It implies that we have found a peaceful way to parent, and then there are these not so peaceful ways to parent out there. And in many ways, that's somewhat accurate. Parenting throughout history, actually, I think has been in some cases, a pretty grisly and violent enterprise where it's adults kind of lording themselves over children. And, even as people have taken some of the physical violence out of parenting, there has been, I think, a lot of the coercion or a lot of the force is still present, right? It's not that people are actively perhaps hitting their kids as much as they used to, or at least not as violently as they used to, but they're still forcing their kids to do basically everything. And one of the discussions it's never had on a public scale. Obviously, it's had in smaller unschooling and self-directed learning pockets throughout the world, but it's never had on a grand scale, which is, does the autonomy and freedom of kids matter? And, as libertarians, obviously we talk often about the invisible gun in the room, right? The fact that you kind of go through your life and people say, hey, you're free. And then if someone asks them, well, what if you decide not to pay your taxes? Or what if you decide not to listen to the authorities? What happens after that? And I think many people's parenting approach is the same way. They have this quote unquote authoritative style. This has become a very popular term. I think, I can't remember the guy's name. I think it's Medina who wrote Brain Rules for Baby. But there's a number of people out there who are talking about sort of the ideal parenting paradigm of being this authoritative, which is to say loving, but also very, very firm and very, very parent-centered, where the parent decides what's best for the child in almost every arena, maybe allows for some token freedoms here and there, and then forces basically everything else. And they talk about how, on average, that yields these supposedly good outcomes. I guess the question I would like to ask to the authoritative paradigm is, what's your plan if your kid doesn't decide to go along with it eventually? Because as someone who's worked in summer camping and worked with kids, thousands of kids in a number of different capacities, I will tell you that for some percentage of children, they will not be told what to do.
Right.
And I'll raise my hand and say I was one of those kids, right? I don't think I was evil. I don't think I was out to hurt anyone. But there were a number of ways in my life where I simply would not take no for an answer. And this led to a lot of huge struggles between me and all of the adult authority figures that I encountered throughout my life. And so fast forward to today, and when Taylor showed us that video, the RSA anime video, because she ran home and showed it to me, and my mind was blown, because it was the first time, I think, in my life where I allowed myself to think, well, maybe I wasn't kind of broken as a kid, right? Maybe I wasn't, that this perfect system didn't work for me. Well, maybe the system wasn't so perfect after all, and that there's a certain percentage of people who don't want to be, forced to do whatever, right? And so I think our parenting approach and what peaceful parenting sort of means to me is treating kids in the way that I would want to be treated now as an adult, and how I wanted to be treated as a kid, but when that was off the table. So it's not really... So we call it a new take on peaceful parenting, because I think we also try to insert a lot of, sort of more libertarian ideals into our relationship with our kids, which is to say having fewer rules around things outside of don't hurt others and don't take their things. But I think it's really about remembering that if you're going to have rules, then you have to have an or else attached to that. And so trying to have as few rules as possible and more just being a partner along this life journey, So I don't know. It's kind of a scattered and long-winded answer, but I do think that peaceful parenting stirs up a specific idea in people's mind, and our goal is a lot more about partnership, I think, than anything else.
Right, I get that, and I understand from what you're saying that there's a lot more to what you're thinking about when you think about peaceful parenting than we don't hit our kids. There's a lot more behind that. And so I want to talk about some of the ideas that follow from that, or that are connected to that for you. And some of these ideas too, as we talked about when you came to visit, I think are terms that mean different things to different people. And we talked about this term unschooling, which comes up a lot in your podcast. And I think this is a term that definitely means different things to different people. So I wanted to get your take on, what do you take unschooling to mean, and what does it mean for you?
Yeah, we were just talking about this yesterday, the term unschooling, or maybe 2 days ago. The term unschooling is a tricky one, because it's kind of, all it's doing is saying what it's not, right? It doesn't really talk about what it is. And it's a helpful term at times if people really understand what it is. But I actually, with kind of people who are outside of these parenting and self-directed education circles, I don't use it as the first way to describe what we do, because I think it can be confusing and misleading to people. I really, really prefer, honestly, the term self-directed education. And that's kind of, when I think about our educational approach with our kids, that's what I identify really strongly with. And the idea that people will learn best when they are intrinsically motivated by something that they feel excited and passionate about, and that so much learning naturally follows from there. And the learning and the growth is really meaningful when that's happening, because the person is motivated. So go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to just follow up and say to that, like, I don't think that the unschooling idea has to be that you're against school. It's just that you're for helping kids to be self-motivated, because sometimes self-motivated people will find themselves in a schooling environment at some point, right? So that's why I think we're kind of, it's still a useful term in terms of connecting with people who already know the term. And that was, I think John Holt coined the term many, many years ago. So a lot of people, that term has a lot of momentum, and I think it's, it'd be silly to abandon it along the way, but it's almost like the difference between, say, anarchism and voluntarism, where anarchism stirs up a feeling in people's minds of being sort of anti-authority and, wearing all black and throwing Molotov cocktails, and it's against the idea of a government, where voluntarism says, I want interactions to be voluntary. I think our approach to parenting is way more not worrying about schools. Schools are just these buildings that we don't really do much with.
Right.
But, just trying to be pro engaging with our kids, helping them to find what they're interested in and pursuing that.
And I think, can I say one more thing?
Yeah, go for it.
If we're talking about terms, it might be helpful, in case your listeners dive more deeply into this, it might be helpful to kind of talk about what most people mean when they talk about unschooling, and then go further to talk about radical unschooling, because that's a term that you hear used in some circles too. And just really briefly, unschooling, most people are using to refer to kind of learning happening outside of the school system. So self-directed education. And then radical unschooling would refer to people who kind of extend that kind of choice and autonomy and self-directed attitude into the rest of their lives too. So in terms of, giving kids autonomy over how they spend most of their time, and, what they eat and when they decide to sleep and all of that. That would be kind of what people mean when they talk about radical unschooling. There's a whole lot of, misconceptions that can come with that too. But obviously, we do a lot of that, but we're also providing tons of guidance and support to our kids along the way.
Right. I think there's a lot to unpack in that whole approach. And I think you're right. Different people are using it in different ways. And, we spoke just briefly before the podcast started that unschooling can also be confused with what you might call unparenting. And Taylor, you mentioned that as one sort of confusion that can happen. What do you see as the difference between unschooling and unparenting?
Yeah, so I think especially when people first learn about the idea of unschooling, and maybe especially radical unschooling, if it's new to them, there might be this perception that, the parents are kind of sitting off to the side and saying to the kids, hey, do your thing, do what you want, just go for it. And then kind of just stepping back and maybe doing our own thing. And that's so completely not what it looks like for our family. And I think for most families who do this, it's really about recognizing, like James said, that we're kind of walking through life with our kids as their partners. And we're trying to build this partnership where, as adults with a lot of years of life experience, we become these kind of trusted guides and support people to our kids. So we don't, come and tell our kids, how to spend their time and what to do. We give them choices and we let them decide, but we also help them kind of process through this decision-making process, and we support them if they make a decision that ended up feeling like the wrong decision. We're there to help them think through, like, why didn't that feel so good? And maybe what might I choose differently next time, because I didn't really love the consequences of that choice that I made. And when I say consequences, I mean true natural consequences,
Like I stayed up late and today I'm really tired.
Exactly. So it really looks like a ton of guidance and support and conversation and engagement and involvement with our kids every single day. But at the same time as, remembering that they are autonomous people who we really want to have agency over their own choices.
Right. Absolutely. I'm still mulling over a lot of these different concepts and trying to work out exactly what I think about them and how they all fit into my own sort of understanding of parenting and what my responsibilities are. And it would be really interesting to get your take on some of the things that I'm currently puzzling over, if that's okay. So I think, I understand quite a lot of the background to a lot of these ideas like unschooling. And James, you mentioned John Holt, and he wrote a book called Instead of Education, which I've actually reviewed in a previous episode. I found that to be a really inspirational book. One of the things you mentioned before, James, was, even if you're unschooled, even if you're self-directed, you might be in a school environment at some point, if that's kind of the way that you want to go. And the way I make sense of that is that he sort of described this difference between essentially compulsory education and voluntary education. The argument that really sort of stuck with me was his idea that the problem is when you force kids to go and sit in a school or whatever, then the real lesson that you're teaching them is you don't know what you're doing and you have to do this. And that is a much more important lesson than anything else that they might hear when they're sitting in class. And so his argument was that there's a difference between what he called schools with a capital S and schools with a small s. And the schools with a capital S is this institution that you're forced to go into, as opposed to an educational experience that you can have that's voluntary. And that really stuck with me, because that seemed to me to be a core thing. Like the school, the fact that it's a place with lots of people sitting in chairs isn't the point, although that is a very old-fashioned way of learning. But it's the compulsoriness of it that seems to be at the core.
I think there's a lot of unintended lessons from compulsory schooling, right? I mean, at its core, the lack of trust, I think, is fundamental. I think it creates an obvious dependence upon authority figures to make decisions for you, both when it comes to, what subjects should be interesting to you. This is a big Ken Robinson thing, and it's kind of funny that I don't think he ever, at least when I was engaging with his stuff more, ever really landed on unschooling eventually. But he's a big fan of dance, for instance. And, for him, it's a huge crime that schools are making dancing seem less important than math and English. Well, why not extend that out to just everything in the world, right? Like, what if as an adult, I remember this, the first time I tried to run summer camp totally on my own, or at least as the main person that was in the saddle. The first year I went in and I really wanted to try and figure out what the kids would want to do there. And I was, inside my own head, patting myself on the back, thinking, how many adults spend so much time thinking so hard about what kids actually want to do, and then providing them, basically a curriculum, a set of activities that's been designed specifically with their desires in mind. And of course, the kids come up and, most of them are having fun, but some pretty large percentage of them, maybe even if it's just 10%, we're kind of looking around feeling a little bored. Like, what am I supposed to do now? Right. And then it occurred to me, right, no matter how hard I try, I cannot possibly come up with all of the different ways a child might spend their time and be engaged. And so all we did literally was just hang a sheet on the wall that said camper directed activity sheet, and kids could sign up and they could come up with their own activities. And if they could find like 4 or 5 other kids, just because, for staffing issues on our end, then we would help them facilitate the activity. And it led to an explosion of creativity where kids were doing everything from, like, one of the most important innovations, if you want to call it that, was just hangout time. They didn't want a pre-programmed activity, especially the teenagers. They just wanted to sit on couches and talk to one another, or go in and we made a hammock village to facilitate that later on. Right. But there were so many different beautiful examples of kids coming up with things that we never would have come up with in a million years based on their very niche interests that we might not even know about. Like one was a Doctor Who meetup was another one. And so the list goes on of their really cool, innovative ways of spending their time and enriching themselves. And I think that's when I really started to learn that as the well-meaning authority figure, it doesn't matter how much you care about the kids. There's no replacement for simply being self-directed. And I think also, like, if people turn that lens into their own adult lives, it becomes very obvious as well. Like, no 25-year-old would ever sign up to have some really fun, smart person map out 40 hours a week for them, right? Like, no one in their right mind would ever do that. Because why would they? Why not just map out your own time instead of doing it yourself? And so I think when we extend the same courtesies, like a big core of my parenting and child development approach is just extending the same courtesies to a child that I would extend to another adult. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good way of summing it up.
That's really interesting. And you're talking about one aspect that I'm still kind of mulling over in my own mind, and that's the whole self-directed learning thing. Before I tell you about some of the sort of things that I've been puzzling over with that, I remember when you came to visit, James, you gave an interesting example of this self-directed learning, and you were talking about how it's important to avoid so-called teachable moments, and kind of stepping in there. And the way that you spoke about these teachable moments, it came across to me how condescending they might sound. But can you explain what you meant by that?
Sure. Yeah. I don't recall which specific example I was sharing at the time, but I'm sure I can come up with another one now. But it's basically these moments where a child in particular, is totally present in the moment of what they're doing, right? So, they may be playing a game with some friends and they're bouncing around on the trampoline, and then all of a sudden something isn't quite working out. And then, they're kind of working through it. But then the adult comes in and says, now see, child, this is a perfect example of why we use consensus-based decision-making rather than voting, or whatever. Basically seeing some natural thing happening in a child's life and then thinking, aha, this is a moment that I can teach them something that is important to me. And then you pull them out of the moment and you say, okay, everyone take a pause, because now the adult's going to talk and adult explain to you why this thing is really, really important and why it's a lesson you should learn for the future. And it's funny because obviously when you grow up in the traditional, parenting paradigm, I suppose, life is just filled with these moments. And I think you become calloused to them at some point. Like you're just like, okay, here goes. The adult's going to now come in. But when you have kids that are more self-directed, and I would actually love to unpack that term as well. But when you have kids that are making more of their own decisions and pursuing things simply because they're interested in them, someone coming in and kind of pulling all the play and all the fun out of it to make it about learning some specific takeaway, it's just like this really oily, bad feeling. Like this kid was having so much fun. Now I'm just distracting them. Or maybe they weren't even having fun. Maybe it was just something challenging, but I'm distracting them from their own, autonomous, intrinsically motivated motivation for this and making it all about me. And I think that's like one of the biggest lessons I had to learn along the way. And I still have to fight the instinct to do sometimes now, which is, I don't know, just trying to tell them what they should be learning from the experience rather than letting them just learn it for themselves.
Well, I think I know why it's an instinct that we have. Can I say
go.
a little something? I think that, the traditional educational model is one in which we as adults are always looking for the children to prove what they're learning, to show us what they're learning. And we want to see physical proof that they are learning things. And then we're going to evaluate them on how well they've learned it. And that's kind of, especially if that's the model you grow up in, I think we become conditioned to, even if we are educating our kids at home, we have this intrinsic need to see that they are learning, to prove to ourselves that this is working and that we're doing the right thing. So we step in, we have this instinct to step in and kind of share these teachable moments. And what I've learned as we've, backed off of that over the years, I have begun to realize that there's so much learning going on for kids that's happening in their own inner world that we may never see. But as you become more, tuned into it, you do see little pieces of it just in the way that they, change their approach to life, in these little things that they might say in conversation. I have so many moments with my kids now where I'm like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that you had this idea or this thought or you knew this fact, because, I don't ask them to prove to me what they're learning, but it comes out when you learn to see it. But it's kind of, moving away from that need to have them show their learning and prove their learning. But I think that's just kind of why we have that instinct to insert these teachable moments.
Yeah. And that the adult feels the need to make the connections. Obviously, it's like, sitting in a movie with someone and they're explaining to you like, ooh, that's the same guy from the first scene. And you're like, I know, I'm also watching the movie, and I can make these connections.
And it can sometimes really interfere with their own process. Like they might make different connections that we would never think about that are really meaningful and important to them, but we cut that off, I think, when we jump in.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. I think, James, that analogy, just to draw out what you're saying, it's like if you were watching a movie and you had to stop the movie to say, by the way, that's the villain in the movie. That guy is the villain. If you had to do that, then there's something wrong with the movie, right? It's something like that. Yeah. Then obviously, if it requires that level of intervention, in the same way, I think what I took from your point about these teachable moments is if you have to step in and start pointing this stuff out, you're actually taking away from the learning that should take place, that will take place if it's a real learning experience. In other words, if it is a learning moment, you don't need to say anything because the kid's going to be learning anyway, right? And if it's not, then you're just actually artificially loading stuff on there that, as you say, takes the child out of the moment.
I think there's actually some nuance here too, because there's a big difference in my mind between stepping in and a child is, in the middle of a game and saying, everybody pause. I need to explain why this moment's important to everybody. Like, I think that is that teachable moment issue that I would personally want to avoid. But I think there actually are options or opportunities rather, if I'm doing something to kind of narrate my own thought process. So like a child might not see the connections I'm forming. Say a small example might be buying something at the store, right? I'm deciding between two brands. I might not turn to the kids and say, hey kids, here's how you should decide between two brands. But I might just talk aloud to myself almost and say, let's see, these two are pretty similar. Let's see, does this one have any ingredients I don't like in here? Oh yeah, it does. It has high fructose corn syrup. So I'm going to put that one back and go with this more natural option, right? So a little thing where I can kind of open them up to my thought process. And if they ignore me completely, that's totally fine. That's not going to be on the test later, but kind of narrating my own process aloud, to give them the opportunity to have a little window in on connections that they might not even know could possibly exist, right? So it's not that I never share my opinion or never, I'm never making connections openly. In fact, I like to model making connections because I'm doing that constantly, and giving them a little window into it so that maybe the next time they're deciding between two things, they'll at least understand that, or think more deeply about the opportunities to weigh different factors or something, right? So it's not that I never want to talk about things I think or things I believe. It's just about not interrupting them when they're already busy with something.
Yeah, I get that. And I think it's important not to take from the teachable moments the idea that you never say anything or whatever. And I mean, one of the technique that I found quite helpful to sort of wrap my head around, especially for our daughter who's only one, is this idea that one thing that you can do that can be helpful, especially if a child is just exploring stuff and doing stuff, is rather than like constantly interrupting with questions or stuff like that, you can do, I think Janet Lansbury calls it sportscasting, where you basically, without making a judgment or anything, you just talk about what the child is doing because you're providing words for things that the child is experiencing that can be associated with the activity. So you can just say, "Oh, you're opening the packet. Oh, they've fallen all on the floor." And you're talking about stuff, but it's not. It's actually just in a way you're kind of providing a soundtrack for the kid to explore stuff and to know what words are associated with stuff without saying, without interrupting the kid from the experience of what they're doing.
Well, I noticed you doing that a lot when we were hanging out with Freya, especially, she's pointing at the pictures in the book or, reflecting back to them to help them to feel understood. I think especially when a child's forming language around things, that's critical. And I think actually a way that can be extended even into older childhood is around more complicated things like feelings and emotions. When I work with kids, many times the most frustrated kids are the kids that seem to be having the greatest difficulty in social environments are the ones that don't feel understood. And I think communicating a specific feeling through words is something that, many grown-ups, especially well-spoken ones, take for granted. But when you have kids, they're just fishing for words. They have this new emotion, jealousy, let's say. And if they don't have a specific word to describe that, they can be totally at a loss. So that sportscasting concept, I think, applies for quite a long time. And I think it can be done from a place of generosity. I think that's like the thing I like about it most is that it's coming from a place of, you might not be making sense of this. Maybe you are, but this communicates that I'm listening and paying attention to you and that I care about you and I love you and I'm noticing what you're up to. And if you need a little additional context, it will help with that too, right? So it's very much not about, pulling them out of playing with the toys to teach them the physics principles of the toys involved, but about, just being there alongside them, And I think you had nodded to this concern about the idea of kids being self-directed earlier on. And maybe this speaks to that a little bit as well. And I'd love to know more about what your concerns are with that term or just ideas are about that term.
Yeah. Shall I tell you what?
Go for that. And then we can address it.
So here's where I'm at in terms of thinking about all these things. And your podcast definitely has given me lots and lots to think about and the other books that I've read and so forth. And, with things like peaceful parenting, absolutely. I mean, no question that we're doing peaceful parenting. With the idea of applying voluntary principles to a child's life, absolutely. That makes total sense to me. So, for example, I can never see us forcing our daughter to go to a school. I just can't see that being something that we'd ever think of doing because it just doesn't make sense. And I completely get that distinction between activities and the way that John Holt put it, between, if you like, voluntary education, things that the child is interested in doing versus things that are compulsory that you just force them to do. So I get all of that. But I'm trying to differentiate in my own mind the difference between the concept of something being voluntary and the concept of something being self-directed. And as far as self-directed stuff goes, I think it's wonderful for kids to spend as much time doing self-directed stuff as possible. So, James, you mentioned the camp, and in that kind of environment, you're also talking about whole days and so forth. And I can totally get that kids want to be able to have a lot of autonomy and choose to do things and so forth. And so as a basic principle, self-direction and autonomy, I get, and that's great. My thoughts and the place that I'm currently sort of puzzling over and mulling over is if something being voluntary and something being self-directed is not the same thing, do I really believe in self-directedness for education as a whole? And I'm not sure I do. I'm still puzzling over that. I'll tell you why. Because, for example, I think there are some things that, and I mean, in a way, James, you actually mentioned this in one of our discussions, that, there are some things in life that if you just surf around on YouTube and look at stuff and do things that you can do in a self-directed way, you may just never come across that are useful to know and that are important to know. And I think there are some things that I feel like I have a responsibility that I need to make sure that my daughter does know before she is fully off looking after herself in her own life. And in that sense, if I had that idea, I mean, I definitely believe in the principle that I can't force her to do stuff. If I think it's important for her to learn about, for example, be aware of financial literacy and to be able to know how to manage her money, right? I'm not going to force her to sit down and say, right, now we're going to talk about money, but it's definitely something that I feel like at some point I need to make sure that she does know how to deal with that, because a shocking amount of people leave home and really don't know anything about money, and I don't think it puts them in a good position. Same way with regard to literacy and numeracy. I think it's absolutely vital that she's able to cope with the world. And I'm not saying in any way that schools provide these things. I mean, a shocking number of people come out of school barely literate and barely numerate as well.
Right.
Even come out of university barely literate and barely numerate. So this is by no way me comparing an unschooling approach or a self-directed approach to schooling and saying, look, they do it better. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying, I guess where I'm at is I feel like I have a responsibility to get my daughter interested in a number of things, and it's my job to make that fun and to make it something that's going to be interesting for her. And I guess if I'm really honest with myself, that isn't entirely self-directed then. I think it has to be voluntary, but I'm not necessarily sold on the self-directed aspect. At least that's what I'm mulling over. So I just sort of put it out there. I'd love to hear what you think about all of that.
All right, let's do it.
Yeah, no, I love listening to you kind of share your thoughts about, where you're at with that and puzzling through that. So one of the really cool things about kids whose kind of life is voluntary and the way that they spend their time is voluntary is that, from my experience, all of the things that you mentioned, and they're all great examples, financial understanding, literacy, numeracy, these are things that remain really exciting and fun and interesting to kids when they have a choice about how they're spending their time. So in my experience, our kids are living in the real world, right? They're not going off and sitting in a building for however many hours every day. And so they are seeing our day-to-day life all day, every day. So exposure to financial things is something that they wrestle with and grapple with all the time. They see us making financial decisions, and it becomes just a natural part of our life with them. Same as reading and writing and math. They are encountering the need for understanding numbers and the need for being able to read in all of the things that they want to do every day. So, our oldest son has learned to read with our support, but we have not taught him. He's learned to read because he has seen that it's a really, really important and valuable thing and skill to have. So I guess kind of my response to that is like, you may find that you may not have to make these things interesting to your daughter because they are just like she was motivated to learn to walk. And just like right now, she's so motivated to learn to talk. Yeah. And I mean, we were with her, right? She was...
Sorry, I just started thinking about her talking.
I know,
right.
I know. Yeah, she was so motivated to communicate, and she will be motivated to learn to read and to understand numbers because she will start to see as she becomes older and gains an understanding of the world that these are really important skills to be like a happy functioning person.
Yeah,
go ahead. You look like you want to say something.
I do want to say something. Well, because I think because I do think there's a distinction, because with something like literacy and numeracy, like those are so fundamental to existing in the world as it exists right now, that it'd be pretty hard, I think, to not encounter those in some capacity and to see that they're important. And when given space to pursue them, when you're developmentally ready, that you'll achieve that developmental milestone, as it were, right? I think a lot of people, because I think what you're describing, Jake, is like, this feeling of urgency around your kid acquiring these very obviously necessary skills. But I think many of those skills will also be obviously necessary to the child as well. Like she'll see, well, if I can't, send emails to the boys across the sea, if I can't learn to read and write or whatever, right? Like there will be infinite numbers of ways that not being able to read is just a huge hassle. And self-directed people, I think, will choose to solve those problems on their own. So I think that's part of it. I think there are some more nuanced things that I think, like, all three of us would agree that if we didn't know them, our lives would be a lot worse off. But the world doesn't necessarily just walk right up and show you the need to understand, say, compounding interest, right? Or like, understand, predatory lending, or any of these number of things that we all understand as a result of, mostly learning them after schooling and out of our formal education, but that have created a lot of good things in our lives, right? And we've seen the pain of people who don't understand those concepts, and we want to help our kids avoid that pain.
Yeah.
I think it's a huge motivation. And I think there actually is a lot of opportunity to share, again, narrate our own thought processes around things without ever sitting down and having a formal discussion with our kids, or having like
a formal lesson, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. And I think as I'm thinking more about the specific term of being self-directed, that does sort of not tell the whole story with us, because we actually do present our kids with a number of intentional options around the house. Like they can always opt into whatever it is they're interested in or passionate about. And along the same lines, like we do have art supplies laid out in the house if they ever decide that they want to get more into the arts, right? Like we didn't force them to come to us and say, hey, I'd like some markers so I can draw.
Right.
So in that way, it's not perfectly self-directed, I guess. We are sort of the environment creators, the people that are laying out a number of baseline offerings for which our kids to iterate on. And then if there are certain big deal concepts, like another example might be surrounding, let's say, religion. Maybe they hear some religious belief somewhere and they come in. I probably wouldn't say like, hey, go Google it and try to figure out what you think. I probably would want to have a conversation about it and ask questions and do those sorts of things. And, where some of my values or some of my thought processes are going to come through. So I don't want to suggest that self-directed learning, as we're describing it, should be at the exclusion of presenting your kids with options or, sharing things that are interesting or exciting for you or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that's a great distinction. I think I see what you're saying, Jake. The term self-directed can potentially imply to some people that the kids also have to like go out and find on their own everything that they might want to learn about or everything that might be interesting to them. And yeah, that's totally not our approach. I think one of our earliest episodes we did on One Free Family was about how we create a rich environment for our kids in their lives and in our home. So that one might be an interesting one. For us, self-directed means we, as the, people who have been in the world for many more years than them, we kind of look around and offer them all of these different options, this whole menu of different things that might be interesting or engaging or exciting to them. And then they choose what they want to really go deep on. And we continue to kind of circle back to things that they express interest in or to find new things to pull into their environment. So we're definitely, always looking for ways to make their world bigger for them, I guess is a way to look at it. And then, like you said, not then saying, well, let's sit down and have a lesson about this, but hey, here's this thing. If you want to know more, happy to dig into it with you, but it's here and it's waiting for you should you become more interested.
Right. Thinking it through, I think the thing that I've been puzzling over, and what you say makes total sense, and I can see the environment that you try and create and sort of, I can see that you are intentionally putting stuff in your children's way, so to speak, that they can encounter. I guess when I think about the term self-directed, what I think when I'm honest with myself is, well, you know what? I do have an agenda. It wouldn't really be honest for me to say, yeah, it's totally self-directed. She's going to, I'm just going to facilitate her own interests. To a certain degree, that's absolutely true. But it's also true that I have an agenda. I have certain things that I think is vital for me, to certain knowledge that I think is vital for her to acquire while she's in my care, because I consider that to be part of my responsibility. And I guess what I'm wondering is, does that break the concept of self-direction? And I'm interested to hear what you think. I think for some people it would, because for some people who take this approach for self-directedness, my very having an agenda would kind of be off message with the self-directed approach. But I get the sense from what you're saying that it's not necessarily true for you. I mean, what do you think?
Well, I think having an agenda is natural. And when we have a child, it's going to be impossible. I think it's an unreasonable bar to set for yourself that you'll be totally agendaless. Like a basic example would be what books are in your house. You're obviously not going to just go get every book and put it in your house, right? So there's going to be some materials that are going to be there that are representative of your values and interests or what have you, right? I think the fundamental question at the core of all of it is, what's the plan if your child says no, right? So like if Freya, you're trying to do the financial literacy discussion with her, every time you bring this up, her eyes glaze over and you can tell that she's elsewhere, right? Like, what's the plan at that point? Because in my opinion, helping a kid to be self-directed is leaving space for them to reject the things that I think are important. I can make my case. I can talk about it a lot. I can bring it up frequently. If I really want, I can bring it up so frequently that I can annoy my kids or do it at the cost of some of our relationship. Like, oh, here's that annoying guy who all he wants to talk about is financial literacy. Or I can just try to read their cues. And in the same way, like, when we're visiting you in the UK and say you were really, really excited about us visiting a castle, we went out to the Arundel Castle there. If you first brought that up and we just weren't interested, you wouldn't press the issue. Now, if you thought we were going to go to a really dangerous neighborhood in London, you might have pressed the issue a little bit more. If we ultimately said, hey, we just really want to go there, I don't think you would have stood in front of the door and blocked our exit, And I think that's really the way I try to think about my kids is like, yes, I think there are some things that are so vital that I really, really, really hope my kids will learn them. And at the end of the day, I won't block the door to them deciding not to. And in addition to that, I also trust that the case for these things is persuasive enough that I won't need to, right? And so I think that's like where the trust element comes in, which is like, yeah, there are some things, and I think reading again is an example of this. I personally shudder to imagine my kid being 30 years old and being unable to read because of the way I parented, right? Like, if there were other ways that I could have parented that might have led to that outcome, it would be hard. I'd be hard pressed to say I would want my kid to be self-directed and not be able to read someday. And that would be worth it, right? If I'm just being honest with myself. And I also just trust that my kids are smart, capable, aware people, and that they'll come to that. So I don't feel the need to make the contingency plan if my kid decides for his whole life that reading is unimportant, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, so that's really interesting. And reading is a good example because, I mean, I didn't say reading first because it's a bit of a cliche because it's the one that everyone always brings up about unschooling approaches. But it is one that definitely is super important to me. And so I've thought about it a lot. And I think, James, what you said is really interesting, that what are you going to do if she's not interested? Well, first of all, I will totally acknowledge what you said, that if the case is clear enough, then this is probably going to be a non-issue because she's probably going to be super interested in reading. And as it happens, we have a mat, like a sponge mat, play mat that has letters on it. And, I'm not in any hurry for her to learn to read, but just for fun, I have been playing with her on the mat and showing her the letters, and, the letter A and the letter F have been, playing and dancing with each other or something like that. And it was just for fun, and I kind of forgot all about it. And then we walked past McDonald's, and she just looked at it and said M, and she's obviously she's taken it in without me even. Really, this was just for fun. So I could totally get that this is probably just going to happen anyway for all the things that matter, because it's not vital to me that she takes a great interest in, I don't know, learning to play violin or something that I think is, totally, that's the kind of thing that if you want to do that, you can, but I'm not going to force her to do that kind of stuff. But things like reading and writing, the case is so clear that I think you're right. It probably will not be an issue. Having said that, I think it is very important to answer the question that you had, James, is, okay, so what if she says that she's totally not interested? And the way I view that is, then in a way, it's my job to find a way to make it interesting to her. And what I mean is, I consider that it my job to be essentially to sell it to her as being something that is relevant to her and is interesting. Now, that doesn't mean that because I also have a position of authority and because I, can potentially control what her activities are, that doesn't mean I get to abuse that position of authority by haranguing her about it the whole time, right? When I say sell it, I really genuinely mean, if she's not interested in reading or writing or whatever else it is that I think is really important, then I have to take that as, well, I'm obviously presenting this in a way that's either boring or condescending or irrelevant to her needs or whatever. And it's my problem to rethink that. And I really don't think that she's going to, get to the point where she's leaving home and over all those years, she's never been able to learn to read and write and have basic math skills and an understanding of some of the things that I think you need to survive in the modern world, like just arithmetic and statistics and some of the things that you need to cope with modern life. I mean, I'm sure that those things are going to come up in a natural way. But in answer to your question, James, I think the response I take is if it's not working, then it's my fault. I have to rethink the approach. And it may well be that I have to scratch my head for a long time before I bring it up again and find a way to approach it. But I sort of, the key point for me is I'm trying to work out the principles. And when I think about self-directed, if I really take that idea seriously, then self-directed isn't quite the right term for me, because I do have this agenda and there are things that I want her to learn, and I am going to try and sell some ideas for her. So I get it being voluntary, and maybe it's just the use of the word self-directed that I'm still sort of struggling with, but that's why I find that a little bit difficult.
Yeah, I think you made a persuasive case that what we're describing isn't a simply self-directed approach. I think that's, well, I guess it's really about the directed piece, I suppose, if we really want to get into the semantics, right? Like, are we directing our kids by laying out a specific environment for them? Or are we, facilitating, or are we, so maybe I'm going to go back to the drawing board and try to really figure out. I don't know that I have a perfect response to that just yet, but I do think that at the end of the day, a lot of the contingencies that we put in place for the things that we're scared of are oftentimes based on stories we heard ourselves growing up about, and feelings that we were given around when people should learn to read.
That's what I was going to say.
No, you go then.
Well, yeah, I was just thinking about that. I love this idea of thinking about our own agendas and what they are, because I've actually had a pretty, interesting evolution in terms of my own agenda for my kids. But when we're talking about, things like reading and writing and, some financial literacy, I think where I see a lot of parents who are trying, a self-directed approach, where I see people get tripped up is when their child doesn't grasp the thing at the same time that kind of the schooled culture tells us a child should. Right. So for example, you'll hear about, let's use the term unschooled because that's just an easy description right now. You'll hear about unschooled children who learn to read when they're 6, and you'll hear about other unschooled children who really don't become fluent readers until they're 12, because different people are ready for it at different times. It's just that the way that we approach education tells us that everybody should be reading by the time they're 6.
And it's extremely uncomfortable if you meet a kid who's 9 and can't read.
Right.
That's and you're quote unquote not doing anything about it. That's
right. And so that's definitely where I see people start to get really nervous and experience a lot of fear. Now we personally, haven't had that to deal with yet, but I think there's a great chance that we could. Our kids are still young. The oldest,
we've got the 3 of them. So.
Yeah, we've got the 3 of them, and there's probably going to be one of them who doesn't, become a fluent reader or fluent with numeracy until they're older than what school says the norm is. But I think that's where it's really important for us to kind of check in with ourselves and to remember that, just the same way that kids learn to walk and talk at different times, that they're going to learn other skills at different times too. And if we try to push it sooner than they're wanting it or sooner than they're ready, I think we really risk them learning it in a shallow way that isn't really meaningful to them, or that doesn't really mean that they have full understanding of it. And I think we also risk making it really painful for them and making them dislike it. So I think kind of being able to really check in with ourselves during those times and be open to their path going on a different timeline than we want it to is really important.
Yeah, I think there's also a persuasive case to be made that, because Jake, you talked about the role of the parent, like making a more persuasive case or making the sale on a certain subject or whatever. I think there's a persuasive case to be made that pushing too hard in some of these areas can help one's child start to hear a story or try to internalize an idea that they're actually something wrong with them because they're either not interested in or not good at something when their parent or some other authority figure like a teacher is demonstrating that it's very obvious that they should be interested in it or capable of doing it. Right.
Yeah,
so
that's
like
a good point.
Math comes to mind for me immediately here, where some huge number of people claim that they're terrible at math, that they hate math, that they just can't figure out math. And they're not talking about calculus. They're talking about like
basic math,
mental math of like double digit addition or something that I personally believe, and I think, research would back me up here, that every single person on earth is capable of doing, because it's just not every single person.
Yeah.
Basically everyone you would picture when we're talking about this, the types of people that normal folks that are just teenagers, right? The people that sit there when they look at a math problem, they feel confused and upset. A lot of that is just trauma, literal trauma from being a child and being in a classroom where their brain wasn't developmentally ready for a certain concept, like multiplication is the one I always point to. And there was some grown up standing there like, you seriously can't figure out this multiplication problem, and implying what's wrong with you, right? And you don't have to be mean about it to convey that feeling as well. Like you can sit there and just kind of seem confused or seem really pushy or whatever.
Or the kid can just be sitting there and looking around and seeing that some of the other kids get it and they don't. And sometimes that's enough to feel like. And the
comparison game, for sure. Comparing with siblings, comparing with neighbors, other peers as well. So I don't know. I guess like I know that there are things that are really important to me that I really, really hope that my kid will pick up someday. And I'm also going to be really hesitant to employ anything beyond simply laying things out in front of them and letting them pick them up on their own timeline, because I'm concerned about the negative effects of doing something else. And so I don't know, maybe that's why I lean. And if you picture self-directedness as a spectrum, we lean very, very, very heavily towards self-directedness, even if we don't wind up hitting the core principle of doing it all the time.
Yeah, those are really interesting points. And I think it's definitely worth thinking about the importance of addressing your own agenda as a parent and making sure that you're not imposing things on your kid because of your own ego about what it makes you look like as a parent. So Taylor, you mentioned, the question of, so what are you going to do if your kids don't learn to read in what is considered a developmentally normal or regular timeline? And I think the interesting thing there is that that's going to pose two problems. One is you're going to be thinking, I wonder if my kid's going to be okay in terms of learning to read, and they need to have that skill. And the other is going to be, what does this make me look like as a parent, and how are people going to view me? And I think it's going to be very, very important to not start saying, for the sake of my child, I'm going to push them, when really what's going on is I feel embarrassed because my child isn't reflecting myself and my value as a parent in the way that I want. And so it's going to be in those kinds of situations, I think it's going to be really important to try and disentangle your genuinely good parental motives towards the best interests of your child and your one's inevitable self issues about how do I look and how embarrassing is this going to be and how am I going to handle it? How is my ego going to handle it?
Right. How am I going to explain to my parents that my kid is 9 and doesn't know how to read? It reminds me of like
so important.
when you go to visit somebody's house and they say like, oh, I'm so sorry, it's messy. Like we haven't cleaned up in a while. They're telling you, basically they're communicating, I don't want you to judge me based on the cleanliness of my home. And in some ways, right, they made a decision to not clean it up to whatever standard. So they're communicating, I had a different goal for this or whatever. But when you talk about your own kids that way, I think that's pretty problematic, because you will see parents all the time, like acting as though their kids are this direct reflection in every way of who they are as people. And if you hold yourself to that standard, if you think of your kids that way in the same way as something that you actually do have total control over, you're setting everyone up for a pretty toxic relationship. Like, if I walked into a party where Taylor was telling a loud story to somebody and I was like whispering apologies to everyone else around, I don't think that would be representative of a pretty healthy relationship, right?
It wouldn't be very nice.
No, it wouldn't be. Well, and it would also, it would just be very strange. But, parents talk about their kids and, talk about their kids in apologetic tones or, act embarrassed about their children a lot. And I think that's just another sad example of how society views the adult-child relationship.
I was just going to say, I think you're hitting on something really huge right here, which it's taken me a while to realize, but it's that so much of making the choice to parent in this way, there's so much, it's about us as people as much as it is about our kids. And you start to see all of the ways that it really requires some really, really deep reflection about ourselves and our egos and our agenda, to use your word. And there's so much self-work that happens. Sometimes I think it's even more work that I'm doing on myself, because honestly, like, my kids came into this world super curious and excited to learn, and I need to work on myself so that I can get out of their way and support them to do that. So I think you're just kind of hitting on the idea of how much it comes back to self-reflection, and it's huge.
Yeah, it's like we were talking about in the conversation that we had when you came to visit, and I mentioned this on a previous episode, that really is what I see as one of the main leadership roles of parenting, is actually dealing with your own issues so that your issues don't start getting in the way. And a lot of this authoritarian parenting, it seems to me, a lot of what it is it's an approach to parenting which says, my kid must turn out in a certain way, because if they don't, then what does it say about me as a person? And I want this child to look good because that makes me look good. That's kind of really what's going on.
Yeah, your child has a sports car, in your own version of a midlife crisis or something. It is. I mean, it's really. I think there's a lot of psychological things going on when it comes to parenting. Like, I mean, you can obviously see it like at a sports contest, right, where the dad is living vicariously through the son's success, or it's fascinating to observe when you can. It's mostly fascinating to observe it in your own self when it's happening. Like, if you can step aside from it and say, like, I never realized how vain I was until I had a child and, started living a proxy life through them or something.
Well, I think that actually part of why, we talked at the beginning today about the term peaceful parenting and how we said a new take on peaceful parenting. And I think that's part of it for us, why we're saying it's a new take, because I think a lot of quote unquote peaceful parenting material out there is really helpful and useful. But I think the end goal is still like, how do I get my kids to do what I want in a peaceful way? Right. So instead of employing punishment or bribes or rewards, I'm going to do it peacefully, but I'm still going to get them to do what I want them to do. And where we're coming from is really different than that. It's like, how can I live as a partner with my children and recognize that they may not take the path that I think is best for them? And I actually don't know what's best for them because I don't know. I'm not them, right? I don't live in their inner world. And so how can I support their path in the best way possible and not try to get them to fall in line with exactly where I think they should go? And there's a whole lot of peace that naturally just stems from that once you start living in that partnership instead of trying to kind of peacefully get them to go the way you think they should.
Well, I think that's a really great way to kind of wrap up what we've been talking about and bring it back to the different approach that you've taken to peaceful parenting. And we've covered a lot in this episode, but I've really enjoyed it, and it's been great to get your feedback. So I just want to say thank you so much, guys. It's been really fun talking to you. And I also want to make sure that people can find out more about you. So do you want to say where they should go to get your podcast?
Yeah, sure. So it's available on all the different podcast feeds that you might use, iTunes, Stitcher, and so forth. You can also get them right from our website at onefreefamily.com. And if you want to engage in parenting discussions, certainly with us, I think we've responded to basically every post in the Facebook group. I think that's a great place to go too. Again, if your motivation is coming from a place of genuine curiosity about how we can all improve as parents, I think the One Free Family Facebook group is a great place to do that. And that's, I think, just about sums it up, right?
Yeah. Thanks so much, Jake. It's been really fun talking to you. And I don't know, you've given me some new stuff to think about too. So it's fun.
Yeah. I'm going to work on that self-directed term. I'm going to come back to you with another one because we've been using that one a lot lately, but you got me on my toes on that. So I appreciate it.
Well, that's great. I mean, there's lots of other things that I think we could definitely usefully talk about and lots of other ideas that I wanted to cover and that we haven't had time to today. So maybe we'll do this again if it works for you.
It would be great. Would love to.
Great. Okay. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Jake. Bye.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.